Last year, I took part in a research study to test the effectiveness of creatine supplementation on rock climbing performance. And ever since then, I've wanted to do a video on the topic. But then Magnus released his video on creatine and kind of felt like he beat us to it.
Yes!
But we're gonna do a video anyways because we're gonna do something different. No weightlifting, no general strength training, we're gonna go hyper-specific. So today, we're looking at the effect of creatine on finger strength and capacity in rock climbing. First, let's back up a little bit. Let's first figure out what creatine is actually supposed to do, and specifically what the research says creatine is going to do in the case of rock climbing, because it's not quite as simple as increasing strength and power. Luckily for us, we're going to get the help of a world-leading expert in sports nutrition for rock climbing. Ed Smith is finishing up his PhD in sports nutrition for rock climbers, and specifically, one of the major topics he's been researching is creatine supplementation. In fact, the test I'm going to be doing in this video is based on the research he is currently doing. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask Ed about what creatine is going to do for us as rock climbers.
Okay, so basically we have this energy currency in the body known as adenosine triphosphate, and we use this to fuel our muscle contractions. The issue is it's in very limited supply, so we only have enough ATP stored within the muscle cells to provide energy for, say, 2 to 3 seconds. So at this point, we need to regenerate ATP quickly. Now, we can do this via a few different energy pathways. However, in situations where there's an extremely high energy demand, it's crucial this is done extremely quickly. So with glycolysis or aerobic respiration, it's a much longer process essentially to regenerate that ATP. So this is where the PCR or phosphocreatine system comes in. It's our energy buffer that allows us to continue this process of rapidly producing ATP for approximately kind of 10 to 15 seconds. So the role that exogenous creatine, so creatine that we consume, is that it can increase our muscle stores of creatine, which can itself be a limiting factor in regenerating phosphocreatine.
Essentially, creatine is an energy store which naturally occurs in the body, but with supplementation, we can increase the capacity of that store. The reason this is often more useful than carbohydrates or fats as an energy store is it's going to be rapidly available to us when we need to use it in efforts of explosive power. So how does this benefit sports performance?
Yeah, so the general benefit comes in that enhanced recovery capacity. So we've got decades of research now looking at supplemental creatine and its effects on sports performance. And these effects seem most pronounced in near maximal or maximal exercise, where obviously the energy demand is really high and the stress on those systems is really high, but even more so when there is a repeat demand. So we're talking about like repeated bouts of high intensity exercise, whether that be sprints, cycle sprints, or in the context of climbing, it'll be the kind of like resistance training that supports climbing or the actual climbing itself. Other benefits include things like stimulation of satellite cell activation. So we're now talking about like, recovery pathways that are initiated following a bout of training. So part of the adaptation. And satellite cells play a role in increasing the activity, I'm trying not to go too scientific here, but increasing the activity of some of the cells that are responsible for like increasing collagen production, for example, increasing muscle protein synthesis, things of that nature. So it's essentially priming the body to be in a more enhanced anabolic state. There's evidence to suggest that it influences things like secretion of insulin growth, insulin-like growth factor, or IGF-1, which again plays a role in anabolic processes. So we've got the benefits in terms of exercise capacity, we've got benefits potentially in terms of recovery as well. If we pair those two together, then we've potentially got a more effective training stimulus and training outcome. There's also evidence to suggest that creatine can enhance hemodynamics, so blood flow, through influencing nitric oxide pathways, so vasodilators essentially, so enhancing essentially blood flow into tissue.
The key takeaway for me here is that supplementing creatine can quickly and easily enhance our recovery capacity. Climbing is a variable intensity sport. If we're bouldering, we're doing a hard effort on the wall, coming down, taking a rest and repeating with those rest intervals. And if we're sport climbing, we're often resting in between the crux efforts or shaking out on sport climb. These common situations in climbing make something like creatine really attractive. I asked Ed where he thinks creatine will really shine for rock climbers.
Specifically for rock climbing is probably, I think it probably comes down to more like competition scenarios where the recovery period is going to be limited. The benefits overall are probably applicable across multiple sports. When we talk about facilitating the impact of a strength training program, I think that's going to be very similar really for climbing as it is many other sports. So I think the specificity lies in situations where recovery is going to be somewhat limited.
So Ed maintains that creatine can enhance a strength training intervention, and this is what we've seen Magnus do already. What I think is really interesting, however, with creatine is its ability to enhance recovery in a short time window, for example in competition climbing, or really in any situation where we are time limited. And the really cool thing is, this can happen within just a week of loading creatine. No training at all, we can see these benefits really easily and really simply. That's what I'm going to put to the test in this study. So here's what I did. I did a 7-day loading phase where I took 20 grams of creatine every day, separated into 4 5-gram servings. After that, I continued creatine with just 5 grams a day for another few days. This 5 grams is typically the maintenance dose. I didn't change anything else, no extra training, no nutrition plan, just creatine supplementation and my normal climbing routine. The reason this protocol is so short is because I'm not looking for a training effect. When Magnus did his test over 2 months, what we saw was the effect of creatine on his training. Increased capacity, increased recovery, which meant more quality training over a longer period and better training outcomes.
That's amazing. What the hell?
I, on the other hand, want to see an acute effect on my climbing performance without the training. To measure performance, we're going to be using a digital hangboard. This is actually the same thing that Ed used in his research. You'll have seen us use this in our critical force test with people like Stefano and Emil. But I'm going to do the test that was devised by Ed Smith, which is going to be kind of a test of anaerobic capacity. That's the energy system we think creatine is going to affect most. And because I'm interested in how creatine can enhance my recovery, I'm going to be doing 3 sets, one after the other, of an all-out performance test. Each set is going to be a maximal repeater protocol. So essentially that means I'm going to pull as hard as I can for 5 seconds, release and rest for 2 seconds, and repeat. And with this testing protocol brings a really common challenge we have in rock climbing, which is being able to maintain friction throughout that whole set without slipping and potentially ruining the whole test. I want to make sure my first repetition is as good as my last repetition when it comes to the quality of the friction of my fingers on this handhold. Which brings me to the sponsor of this video. For all of the testing I'm doing, I'm using Magdust Super Dry, and it seems small, maybe insignificant, but actually it was super important for me to be able to have really good friction on this hold throughout every test I did before and after. For me, that's one of the most important things about good quality chalk, is it stays on your skin for longer, it keeps your hands drier for longer. That improves the quality of the data I'm going to collect, but for most people when they're rock climbing, that's going to improve the performance of them on their project or in their training sessions. Chalked up, first set. And like a hard boulder problem, I'm only getting 2 seconds rest in between each repetition, which is just not enough time to chalk up. Okay, 7 reps down, and the chalk is like basically exactly the same as before, which just doesn't happen with bad quality chalk. Now I've got 30 seconds rest and the chalk pretty much is still there the whole time, so I don't have to worry too much about chalking up in these like really short rest periods. The best way to stock up on chalk, honestly, is to buy a box of 4 or 8 from Rungni, because this is going to give you a discount on the chalk itself. And then if you use code Lattice, you're going to get an extra 10% off of that already discounted price. That's going to bring high quality chalk down to a reasonable price, and you can find that link in the description below. After taking creatine for 7 days, I can't say that I felt any different at all. One thing that was interesting is I've never worried much about my weight, but actually weighing myself every single day while taking creatine and really noticing that those numbers creeped up a little bit, it did start to play on my mind a little bit that I was getting heavier. But in the end, it was only just about a kilo's increase in body weight. Before we look at the data, I need to mention that I did this test twice before creatine and then once after. The reason for doing it twice is because I wanted to get an idea of the reliability of that test. If I did it 2 times in a row without creatine, would they match up? And actually, the reliability was really good between those 2 tests. So when we look at the data, you're going to see pre-A and pre-B, those 2 tests, and then post. That's the data we're looking at to see if there's been a change from the first 2 tests. My absolute finger strength on the day of testing was down after taking the creatine. I don't actually think this was a sign of detraining or anything like that. I think this is purely, I was just having an off day in this post-test. It was only down by a couple kilos, but keep this in mind for later because I think it's important. Here, we're going to look at an overlay of the force I was able to apply across both of these tests throughout the whole test. These line graphs represent the force I was exerting on that rung across all 3 bouts, but I've trimmed out those rest times to bring them together just so it's a little bit easier to view. First thing you'll notice is that in this post-test, I start by exerting less force than I was able to in the other tests. But keep in mind, I was less strong on this day. But after this, it starts to get interesting. That yellow line that represents my post-test, its performance starts to go up to match that of the previous 2 tests. At first glance, that yellow line appears to actually reach the same level of force after a rest, whether that was 30 seconds or 120, whereas the other 2 tests have this clear trend to decrease across all 3 sets. In fact, if we look at the 30-second rest interval, one of my best performances was in that 3rd set. Without creatine, there is a definite decline in force across the 3 sets. But with creatine, it seems to attenuate those effects of fatigue. It appears that recovery might have been enhanced with creatine, but let's dig a little bit deeper to within those sets. Has creatine helped me maintain the force within the set rather than just across the multiple sets? Each bar in this graph represents the force change within a set. That is the difference between the first repetition and the last repetition. This is going to give us an indication of how dramatically that force decreases within a set. I think at first glance here, it appears that creatine is able to maintain the force within a set much better than when not using creatine. However, I was not able to pull quite as hard on this day of post-testing. I was not quite as strong as I was in the previous 2 tests for whatever reason. If we look at the test where I was taking 30-second rest intervals, and we look at that very last test, the one where I was actually able to perform really well in that final set, you can see the drop in force is much more dramatic here. It's a huge bar compared to the others. And this just represents the fact that if you can start that set with more force, you're more likely to have a more dramatic decrease in force. You're going to fatigue faster because you've been able to perform so well at the beginning. This means when I look at this graph, I can't confidently say that creatine is the reason that I was fatiguing less within a set. It could also just be down to the fact that I was able to produce less force at the beginning of each set on that day. So between set recovery looks pretty good. The within set recovery is kind of questionable. The next thing I want to look at is anaerobic capacity, and I'm going to measure this by the amount of work done cumulatively across all repetitions within each set. Total work done within the 30-second rest condition was pretty much exactly the same across all 3 tests. This shows that there's really good test reliability at least. The main difference here is the shape of those 3 bars in that post-test. The total amount of work done in the 120-second rest condition was actually less by about 6% compared to the previous 2 tests. This is interesting because it kind of shows there's 2 ways to perform well in anaerobic capacity. One is by exerting a lot of force but also fatiguing really fast, and the other is by exerting less force but being able to sustain that for the whole set. For me, it's really hard to say whether this was due to my maximum strength on that day of testing, or whether it is due to creatine being able to also support my recovery and capacity later in that test. This is a lot of data with no statistical power because it's just me. But luckily, the study is not over, because when I interviewed Ed, he had just finished his research study with a whole cohort of participants. So I wanted to know what Ed had seen in his data.
So the effect on strength, and this is going to come across as quite contradictory, but essentially there was a significant improvement. So statistically, there was a significant improvement in peak force. So that could be any contraction, essentially across the 15 contractions. However, it didn't exceed the threshold for what's considered a minimal detectable change with a confidence interval of 95%. So that's basically, you are pretty certain that the result exceeds the variability in the testing alone. And that's extremely difficult to do in any sport, not just climbing. Unfortunately, even with a protocol as reliable as the one that we managed to create, you're still looking at needing to see changes, say, beyond 5% for average force, or beyond 8% in terms of peak strength, like that kind of thing. So something's got to do a really good job of improving performance before you can say with a really high degree of certainty that that is the reason for that change. So where we've seen more definitive effects, appears to be in the later set. So in this scenario, it's set 2, set 3, and more pronounced at the very end of those sets, so the final contraction. So that's where we see a wider opening between those pre and post scores for the creatine group that we don't see in the placebo group. So when we overlay the graphs for whether it be average force, peak force, average force for the sets, and even that final contraction, we see almost a perfect overlay, near enough, when it comes to the placebo group, whereas with the creatine group, we see an opening, essentially, between those lines. So as the set goes on, or the test goes on, should I say, as an individual is more fatigued, we see more of an impact, and that's where it becomes both detectable in terms of a minimal detectable change, but also in terms of the significant difference as well.
The simple takeaway for me here is that as we get more fatigued, creatine is able to have a more profound effect on boosting or propping up our performance. If we flip that on its head and we are perhaps a boulderer doing really short efforts with really long rests, it's unlikely we're going to see creatine have much of an effect on our performance, at least within the short acute period. Here's Ed's conclusion from his research.
I think there is enough of a basis to say that creatine is likely to have a performance enhancing effect, whether that be on between bout recovery or capacity to sustain output during the sets. What we will need to do now is determine whether or not that effect is applicable or relevant in scenarios that are, I guess, more ecologically valid. So there's one thing knowing whether or not it influences, say, maximum output, but how applicable is it to, say, submaximal or near maximal contractions, which is more reflective of obviously true climbing. And I think that's where the direction of research will go next.
That last bit Ed wanted me to really stress is that the findings of this research are context specific and just a stepping stone in the right direction. As with a lot of sports science research, we try and remove as many variables as possible so that we can draw clear conclusions from that research. But often as we do that, we start to make our testing look less like the sport and we kind of lose some of that context. So it's promising data for creatine in rock climbing, but it's by no means conclusive with that kind of increased performance of the finger flexors. So did creatine make me stronger? No. Did creatine make me fitter? Maybe, in one sense. I think the data was interesting and not perfect, but also if we put aside just this test with creatine and we look at all the other potential benefits of creatine, I can confidently say that it would be a supplement I would seriously consider when starting a new training program for myself.
Yeah, the only thing I guess would have gone really nicely on the end of that is that a training intervention paired with creatine, because we've not actually, up to this point, mentioned that fact, and I think that's where you will probably see the biggest impact. I think you'll see it more so in terms of it being complementary to a training program as opposed to a tool to increase performance acutely.
So would I recommend creatine for others? There's definitely a few situations where I think it's a strong yes, or at least a consideration. I think bouldering is a discipline in climbing where I think this could be really beneficial, particularly if we're thinking about longer boulders or we're restricted in rest time for whatever reason. In training, we might be doing that on purpose, and it could be a really good way to improve our training quality. There are those climbers at the cutting edge of our sport climbing on really small micro crimps, which might have a genuine reason to be cautious of the weight gain that is associated with taking creatine, especially if they already have a very muscular build.
There'd be quite an effect of like my body weight on like my maximal performance on small holds, and creatine was like quite an obvious difference in that, which if there's like a couple of kilos of water retention, that's quite a significant amount of weight that I couldn't like afford to lose 2 kilos of body weight in order to like accommodate for the extra weight there. So
I think I can see a really strong rationale for sport climbers to supplement creatine, particularly as the research will suggest it's going to support that recovery within an intermittent or variable intensity sport. And sport climbing might be exactly that when we get to a resting position and need to try and recover before or after a crux, for example. You're likely to let creatine work best if you can dip into the recovery zone for 1 to 2 minutes. For trad climbers, I think my advice is the same as for sport climbers. It's going to be probably context specific to the type of routes you're trying. The female climbing population probably has the greatest benefit of supplementing with creatine, particularly because they tend to start with a lower baseline of creatine anyways. There was also a recent research paper called Painfully Ignorant, the impact of gender on climbing injuries. And this actually showed that the female population tended to have higher occurrences of shoulder injuries, whereas within the male population, it still tends to be higher around the fingers. One of our main general recommendations around injury prevention has always been strength training. A good strength training intervention around the shoulder should help prevent injuries later on. And supplementing with creatine could have a beneficial effect to the training intervention you're doing for shoulder health. This wasn't a perfect lab study, but it's the kind of real-world experiment I love doing. If you want a white powder that you don't ingest that absolutely does increase climbing performance, you can steal yourself a deal with a discount on MagDust in the description below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.